we all need to find a place where we're going to plant our kingdom flag. Like we're going to stamp
Yeah.
that thing in the ground
Right.
and we're going to broadcast to everybody. Here's the work. Here's the need. Here's
Yeah.
what needs to be done. If you don't have somewhere to join, come join me.
Right.
Like every single segment needs to have someone who is going to plant that flag and they're going to say, over my dead body, the
That's right.
kingdom is going to come here. Right. And that same person also can help campaign, as we talked about, other flags. But what we're after is people who are going to plant their flag. Hey,
Go ahead,
welcome
Dave.
back to another episode of the H3X Podcast with Mark Gearing and Dave Miller as your co-hosts, where we discuss the head, hearts, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. And so, Mark, today we are going to jump back into our Muddy Boots leadership conversation because we are just on it. That's just what we're on right now. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Yep.
So here's what we're going to jump into today. What is the mud? What is the actual mud that are on the boots of the leaders, and why does it get there? Right. So
Yeah, let's push this metaphor as far as we can.
absolutely. Let's get into the granular. What kind of mud is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just push this metaphor. Here's the thing I want to talk about today. When chaos ensues, which it always does, Muddy Boots leaders do what with the chaos? That's the question that we want to ask, right? And effective leaders are going to be the ones that move towards the chaos, not away from it. So let's just dive into that. What does it look like, especially in movement leadership, as we're trying to see God do some incredible things, especially among the diaspora and the large cities here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, just your basic premise there that leaders move towards problems, chaos, whatever you want to call it. I think over the years, I heard a mentor put it that way, that leaders move towards problems. And that was back
Sure.
when I was in the context of like pastoral ministry leadership. And the exhortation there was like, hey, if you see some challenges, ministry or relational conflict, whatever, like move towards that, because that create that you like keep on target with your vision and alignment, you're moving forward, all those kinds of things. But it's true in every context.
I think the reason we want to jump into this is because there is this understanding in Western culture, because you and I are talking to Western thinkers primarily. I mean, that's because that's who we are, what we're talking about. If it's helpful for somebody outside of that perspective, then that's just the grace of God. If it's helpful to people who are in that perspective, it's also still the grace of God. We'll just leave it at that. But what I would say is we have such a high value on efficiency that Western thinkers are all about efficiency, right? So Henry Ford is famous because he took the making of a car that would take one particular individual like 180 days plus to make on their own and are fabricated, and he brought it down into a 94-minute process with 7 steps. And every single person in the step became an expert at what their part was in making that car. And then at the end of it, you got all these cars. And so what made him famous was he broke everything down. He made it efficient, which made money, which made it faster, which made it better. But here's the downside of what that kind of culture created is that now you have no one person who actually knows how the car's made. You have everybody who knows how to do a piece of it.
Yeah.
A lot of specialists, but not a lot of generalists. And what we're gonna have to do in movement leadership on the front end of this thing is to be generalists. And generalists don't sound very expert in much of anything because they're just moving towards chaos and they're constantly trying to push it in one direction. And so here's the thing. In movement, as we start to get things going, we're never going to get chaos eradicated. It's never going to go away, right? And the value of no mess means that you're a good leader. We've just got to toss that idea completely out the window, right? Because it is the light going into the darkness. It is righteousness making its way into sin. It is the biblical worldview of what God expects making its way into a pagan culture that wants nothing to do with it. Okay, the collision of those two things Mark, that's going to be messy. There's no other way to put it.
Sure is. Yeah.
And it takes time and it takes effort and it takes you, you're not going to make a name for yourself like Henry Ford, because whenever you get done, somebody's going to look at it and they're going to go, what really happened here? Because there won't be anything that's pretty, shiny, and perfect
Right.
to point to.
Somebody's got to actually show other people what that looks like in our context, or we're going to keep losing the beaches. We're going to keep losing ground.
Yeah. And I would put it to you this way. One of the things that I super appreciate about you and the work that you're doing in the Queens area is you have taken what we use at CFC terminology, you're committed, focused, and consistent on one part of your 5x5 in
Right.
Queens. And you've taken ownership of that in a stewardship format. But you're saying, I'm gonna take responsibility for this area, and week in and week out, you're in that area, know what's going on, trying to make headway, bringing the gospel, gospeling, discipling, engaging emerging leaders. Week in and week out, you're doing battle, right, in that particular area, while at the same time, you're campaigning all those other areas and doing anything you can to help others so that other people will take those segments in the same way that you've taken yours. And so the reason I bring that up is to say, I think your Muddy Boots leadership example is exactly what we're going after. I have stewardship and responsibility that God has put on my heart for a particular people and place. It may be a handful of people or places, but you're going to go to work there while you catalyze other things around you, not one or the other, but both and.
And it's pretty messy, to your point. So there's chaos in both fronts. So that's the other piece of it, is like there's chaos as we're engaging with some of those different peoples and places and looking for those that would take ownership and begin to multiply disciples in those. That all sounds grandiose and awesome. But then if you go into that CFC and the place where we're focused, it's messy. And those that we're working with would be the first to tell you, man, there's this challenge and there's this problem, and is this going to fall apart, or all those pieces. But it is engaging the chaos at the edge and pushing towards the gospel going to new people and new places. That's what's going to get that's what's going to get that momentum piece. But at the same time, it's the essence of what's actually happening on the ground that's going to help that to be established as it goes to those people and places. So there's chaos at both fronts, but we've got to lean into both of those fronts in chaos to get traction.
Yeah, and I'd say if it worked on its own, it wouldn't need leaders.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The point of the leadership, the point of the Muddy Boots leader is that we are in the chaos and we're trying to solve the problems, figure it out, work with relationships, work with dynamics, overcome barriers, celebrate successes. We're doing all of those things because at the end of the day, I think success for this Muddy Boots leader, as we're talking about it, is really just leveraging this constant chaos in one direction. It's not that we create the perfect product and we serve it up on a plate and then we put it on a shelf and then other people come and buy that product because we're going, okay, here's the product. It works. Now you come and buy it and you can go and use the product the same way I did. It doesn't work that way. And so the reason we have to be in constant leadership is because everything is in constant flux. And to restate the point, that success is jumping in the middle of it and understanding it well enough that you can leverage all the dynamics to just get the ball rolling in the right direction.
Right. And yeah, so that's going to look different in different contexts. And that's a piece of it, right, Dave, that here in New York, part of what drove my family and those that we're teaming with here towards a more Muddy Boots piece is, first of all, we come in and we feel like scum. We feel like it's like, hey, nobody knows, nobody cares, nobody has any interest in our thoughts on things or what we're doing. So there's that piece of it. We don't have like that just practically, you could even say pragmatically, is like we can't get something going that way. And so I mean, I'm just being really honest with you. So that kind of drove us to like, okay, well, we need to be New Yorkers and understand the reality of what's facing New Yorkers at a local neighborhood level within the cultural context of everybody's constantly moving all over the place, and there's challenges with time, and there's challenges with transience of relationships, all these pieces that we need to be able to dig in and understand well enough so that, number one, we've got some authority and understanding of what that looks like, but also we can coach effectively. We can help those other people in those 5 peoples in 5 places. And so I think it's a little bit of both of those things. It's like there's an authority that emerges out of the fruitfulness that is what that means to have mud on your boots. But then there's also effectiveness, that you've got some understanding of that context to be able to coach those other people in other places, engaging different segments.
And I would say that what we're after, Mark, is that Muddy Boots leader. We're looking for people who, and to be people, not only to look for them, but to be them. We all need to find a place where we're going to plant our kingdom flag. Like, we're going to stamp that thing in the ground, and we're going to broadcast to everybody. Here's the work. Here's the need. Here's what needs to be done. If you don't have somewhere to join, come join me. Like, every single segment needs to have someone who is going to plant that flag, and they're going to say, over my dead body, kingdom is going to come here. Right. And that same person also can help campaign, as we talked about, other flags. But what we're after is people who are going to plant their flag. And I think more and more and more and more, we need to have people, especially in the U.S. context, who are going to plant those flags. And then any catalyzing that they do is going to come out of that fruitfulness and that effectiveness that you just talked about, where they can say, here's what I've learned. Here's where I've been. Here's what I've seen. Let me tell you about it and see how that might help you, but not at the expense of where they've planted their flag. And it goes into that both and, because here's the reason I think we're talking about it, Mark, is I fear that if we're not careful, and if we don't get enough of those flags planted, that we're going to be 5, 10, 15 years down the road in the work, and we're going to find that our movement is a bunch of bloviating hot air talk, and that there isn't any flags that are planted and people who are committed and work that is under all of the radars, right? That is consistent and is immovable and is empowered by the Spirit and called by God and can't be pushed around when push comes to shove, because behind the scenes, there's this foundation that's subversive, that's working its way through, that whenever it kind of pokes its head up, or when people see it, they can't just wipe it away because it's too strong, it's too embedded, it's too concrete, if that makes sense.
The other piece of what you're saying, Dave, that we can't find ourselves 5 or 10 years down the road, is that we've got to face head on why we're doing that in the, you're talking about the U.S. context. And the reality is, if we zoom back and we talk about the history of missions, what little I know of it, you know a whole lot better. You could probably fill in gaps here way better than I can. But we've thought of the mission field as out there, the other, that we're the outsider going in, and we're going to go in and we're going to help these insider people within that context to get something started. Or at least that's how you and I tend to think about that, is we're going to come into this context. We want to get people that are insider, native to that culture, help them to get something started. And so what's happened is the reason why we could end up 5 or 10 years down the road with that is because we're thinking about the US in the same way we might think about India, or we might think about someplace in the 1040 window, the Middle East, wherever it might be, because we're thinking about it as we are outsiders within this context. But the reality is, this is our backyard. This is our space. We are the insiders on some level. And so I think there's just that reality that we can still function in an outsider capacity as a catalyst that can help get things going. But the mud on the boots is to say, we are those people. Like, we can't just say somebody else is going to be that insider and get started. Somebody is the insider that actually gets started, so that there's fruit that is not just a bunch of hot air, but there's actually fruit that behind all of those those leaders and the networks that God is raising up.
Well, and I would say on the positive aspect of it too, here's the benefit of having the laborers, the core missionary task owners, if you will, who are going to plant their flag and do that. They create gravity.
That's right.
They create a hub that things will begin to circle around.
Yes.
They create, in other words, they create an orbit that draws people in, and some of those people are going to go in and they're going to go out. But if there's not that central core gravitational pull that is not moving, right? That is long lasting,
right?
That is there for whatever season the Lord has it. If they don't create that, then the ability to plant the flag and get the word out about the need is going to be very, very hard. And I think sometimes people's mindset is that somehow you just I don't mean to be too facetious here, but if I just put out a website, or if I get a Twitter account, or if somehow I put pictures up on Instagram, that somehow will plant the flag and will get people involved. But you and I will find out that the reason that people aren't involved is because there's no one there who is going to bring that gravitational pull in and create relational organization, even if it's not labeled. But they'll create a relational organization that will draw people in and hold them there long enough that they can learn the lessons, which brings me to the second benefit. Not only do we have that gravitational hold that will plant the flag and keep the kingdom there, which ultimately has to be church, because a church has to take on that responsibility and that ownership. The second benefit of that is that when we're developing an emerging leader, when we're seeing people step into the work and are going to fail forward with us, that gravitational pull will be the connecting piece that will make them stay long enough to make it through the second and the third time of wanting to quit, put them in that crucible and that fire that will allow them to see how important it is to have staying power, to lean into the chaos, to not run away from the chaos. And they will learn lessons that they can't learn in any other way until they're put into the fire and they're required to stay there and put some responsibility on their shoulders. I don't think that can happen with an emerging leader without some gravitational pull to make them stay long enough in the chaos to learn those lessons before they bail because they don't want to do it anymore. I hope that made sense.
That the development piece requires some of that staying.
It has to happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put it to you even this way, Mark. There's got to be a point, because you and I have kicked around a lot about one of the things about Western culture is that we're academically oriented. And in academics, right, you take the test, you get the information, you take the test. As soon as the test is over, you put it to the side, and the knowledge is the point. The information is the point. I would say that we have found in the academic culture that we've got to get to the place to where we push people far enough that they can't just talk their way out of it anymore.
Right.
We've got to get put as leaders, as developing leaders, as growing and maturing leaders, no matter what spectrum you're on, whether just starting out or really well into maturity. We all have to be put into the position to where we can't just talk our way out of it anymore, because that is where we grow. That is where we learn. And that is where the Lord is going to form us and make us into the best catalyst that we can possibly be, because that type of a coach is going to be the best coach.
Yeah.
The one who understands the game, even if they may not be the best player, they're the ones who had to work the hardest to figure it out. They're the ones that become the best coaches.
So this is where I've been at, and I think I've shared this with you guys on this podcast at least a couple of times, but I've been just camping out in Paul's third missionary journey. Well, second into third, because I just see this dynamic that happened with him in Corinth with just crying out in just maybe anxiety, fear to the Lord. And he has this dream, and God says, I have many prepared in this city, and basically stay. And he does. And God moves in a powerful way. And part of the fruit of that is this couple, Priscilla and Aquila, he's working alongside, shoulder to shoulder in the work. And then that leads to this generational fruit of Apollos, and then we see Acts 19 happen, and All of Asia hears the word of the Lord. But there seems to be, in how I read that, and again, I'm processing all of these things in this season. So I'm not saying this is the silver bullet and this is the full explanation of all of what Paul did, or that this is what everybody needs to do. But this is what I'm seeing and processing. Paul slowed down enough he began to think in terms of mentorship and coaching and shoulder to shoulder, muddy boots, if you will, pouring deeply into these leaders such that could happen in Acts 19 and 20. What are your thoughts on that, Dave?
Well, I would say I'll take that lesson and I'll say the Lord shoved me into that in Oklahoma City. If he hadn't have put me into a business platform where I'm responsible for, as a general manager, right, this business, and I've got 25 employees whose livelihoods are depending upon me making the best decisions for their paychecks to continue to come through, and for profitability to actually make this business make sense. If he hadn't have put me in that for the last 9 years, I would have been one of those leaders who moved on. Because what I also understood and know is, in my early days, when the fires got hot, I would stay in those fires for a while, but I don't think I stayed in them as long as I should have in many, many, many environments in my younger days. And so I don't have the ability to move on. And what I've begun to realize because of that is I missed a lot of lessons that I avoided because I didn't want to be in the hot seat, or I didn't want to be in the chaos, or I wanted to shrug some of the responsibility that was getting put on my shoulders. And honestly, the repentance that had to happen in my own life was very simple, Mark. What we saw happen with Paul and the fruitfulness was my summation of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as I've been reading through it, is that the one thing that made the difference on the kings was either they depended on the Lord or they didn't. And there were some kings that went to the Lord for help, and there were some kings that set their hearts to depend on the Lord. And I think this season has taught me that what God expects of me is not to have all the answers. What God expects of me is to set my heart on dependence on him. And the best way for the Lord to train me to depend on him is to put me in situations where I can't depend on myself. And I think those are the situations that we as humans avoid the quickest. Is I'm going to look stupid. I don't have the answers. I don't have in and of myself the resources or the ability to do this situation. And that staying power of saying, I'm going to stay here and depend on the Lord and watch him solve the problem or do what only God can do is scary. But man, it is spiritually maturing on 100 miles an hour faster in those seasons. And I think as someone who's going to move the gospel into dark places, we have got to learn to be people who are going to depend on God in what seems impossible situations, because we're going to encounter them all the time.
You said that 100 times better than I did. That was really good.
But that's the expectation that I think you're pulling out of what we saw out of Corinth and Ephesus.
Right.
Is, I mean, the guy got brought before the tribunal and beat, right? Like,
right.
I'm not saying I like it, but I am saying it this way, Mark. I think the most efficient disciple-making tool that the Lord has in our lives is suffering. And I think it's his grace that says, I'm not going to be as efficient as I could be at all times.
Yeah.
And it is hard to not bail whenever things get to the place where you have zero answers.
But we've got to lean into that to bring that back to this topic we're talking about today of the chaos and our context in North America, that if we're going to see what's happening and we celebrate and we look to and we share the stories, what's happening in all these other contexts, and now in almost every other context, if we're going to see that happen here, we've got to lean into that, or at least a small company's got to, at least, to help to get that started.
We have to lean into it. And I think looping it back around to where we started everything, emerging leaders, you'll recognize them because they're the ones who, when chaos and problems and dependency are required,
right,
you'll watch them move to the problems. Instead of moving away from the problems. And when I see young men and young women, and there's a difficult circumstance in their life, and I watch them lean into it, my ears perk up and I take notice, because I'm going, that is an emerging leader. When I watch a young person in the same scenario find a quick exit as fast as they can, I realize that they're not in a season of life yet where they're ready to lean into leadership. And it is unwise at that point to try to make them leaders or to give them responsibility, hoping that they're going to step up, because what they're showing is the fruit of their heart. They're showing what's in them right now. And it's best and wise to wait until they get to a season of life when you watch them then lean in. And that's whenever you can start going, that's somebody I can start leaning into and trusting and empowering, and for lack of better terms, co-laboring with and what's the word I'm looking for here? Depend upon, where I know they're not going to bow out on me, because it goes back to the bigger conversation. If our movement is not built upon the backs of people who are dependable and responsible, it's not going to take much of a storm before that thing's going to get blown away like a house on sand.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.